In a box of letters never mailed, the children repeat the same words: "We are fine, we are learning," until one smudged line slips through like a confession. It hums at night. The front page was bold, ink still wet, promising good news in a time when good news was scarce. Spring of 1934 had brought little but hunger to Marrow Ridge, a mining town half buried under coal dust and unemployment. Families counted pennies by the handful, bread loaves were stretched thin, and every morning the whistle at the pit carried a tremor of dread. So, when the Marrow County Gazette printed the headline, "Six Siblings Survive the Collapse," readers seized on it like a lifeline. A miracle, they said. Providence. 6 children, pulled from a seam that had given way and swallowed men whole. The paper offered no names, only the place Marrow Ridge and a single photograph. The image was grainy, but clear enough to stir the imagination. 6 children, their faces streaked with soot, eyes wide and expressionless, stared directly at the camera. They looked more like survivors of a fire than a cave-in, blackened cheeks against pale whites of their eyes. The photographer had posed them shoulder to shoulder, a lineup of resilience, though something in their stares unsettled even the most hopeful reader. They did not look grateful, they did not look relieved. They looked as though they had seen something they could not explain and would never be able to forget. By noon, copies of the Gazette were already pinned to tavern walls and grocery counters, passed hand to hand at the company store. Locals speculated on which family the children belonged to. Some whispered that the orphans had been hidden in a company house all along, that no mother or father had stepped forward to claim them. Others insisted they were the children of a miner known only by a surname too common to pin down. The mine's official bulletin made no mention of surviving dependents, only casualties: 4 men crushed, 2 unaccounted for. The discrepancy hung in the air like coal dust. What the town clung to was not the details, but the framing. A miracle had happened in Marrow Ridge, and for a community starved of blessings, the story was easier to repeat than to question. The Gazette's editor was careful. No addresses, no family names, no mention of guardians, only the photograph. 6 faces pressed into the public record, anonymous yet unforgettable. To those who studied the paper decades later, the choice of omission seemed deliberate. The absence of names suggested protection or concealment. Why announce survival without identity? Why trumpet 6 children if no one was allowed to know who they were? In that gap, suspicion found roots. The headline had hidden as much as it revealed, and the photograph of the Marrow children, expressionless, silent, became less a portrait of deliverance than the opening line of a story that refused to be told. The ledger lay open in the clerk's office, a thick-bound book with yellowed pages lined in precise columns. It was the kind of record that turned lives into neat entries, names reduced to rows of ink and stamps. In 1934, after the collapse, 6 new lines appeared all at once. They were written in a hurried hand, as if someone had been told to fill them in quickly, before questions could be asked. The headings were familiar: name, date of birth, next of kin, guardian. But when it came to the guardianship line, the entries broke from custom. Instead of a mother's name, or a father's signature, each space carried the same mechanical phrase: guardian, company trust. Beneath it, a rectangular stamp pressed in purple ink, Marrow Consolidated Coal, and in the notes column, 4 words repeated like a refrain: family relocated unavailable. It was an odd phrase, one that implied absence without explanation. Relocated where? Unavailable to whom? No address was given, no confirmation of departure. For other children in the ledger, there were details: an aunt listed in another county, a grandmother in the next township, a farm couple willing to foster. For these 6, there was nothing but the company itself, an industrial entity standing in for flesh and blood. To the officials who copied the book, it must have seemed strange, but the stamp gave it authority. The coal company had long ruled the town's affairs, issuing pay in scrip, setting rents, even mediating marriages through its priests and foremen. If Marrow Consolidated claimed guardianship, no one dared dispute it. Years later, researchers who sifted through the county archives stopped at these 6 lines, puzzled by their uniformity. Each child's name was followed by the same impersonal notation, as if they were not individuals but components of a single transaction. In the margins, faint pencil marks hinted that a clerk had hesitated. One scrawled, "Verify," beside Elsie's entry before erasing it into a smudge. But the final version stood unchallenged: 6 children, no parents, only the company. Locals remembered whispers at the time. The mine disaster had taken men underground, and some said the mothers had gone with them, not into the shaft, but into silence. There were rumors of hurried departures, wagons leaving in the night, a train ticket purchased under a false name, yet no record surfaced to confirm any of it. All that remained was the ledger, its cold neutrality masking something deliberate. The absence of parents was more than clerical omission, it was erasure. The children's lineage was severed on paper, their identities tied not to blood but to an institution with iron gates and chimneys that smoked day and night. To history, the ledger became the first artifact of concealment, a document that named them while simultaneously unmaking the family they had come from. It was the opening of a file, not the preservation of a home, and in those empty lines lay the first real clue that the miracle of Marrow Ridge was being rewritten as something else entirely. The photograph surfaced decades later, pulled from a shoebox of ephemera found in the attic of a house that had once belonged to a mine supervisor. It was curled at the edges, the gloss burned away in one corner where a match or candle had licked too close. What remained was still enough to haunt. 6 children stood shoulder to shoulder on a porch cobbled from stacked mine timbers, their small bodies swallowed by clothing meant for adults. The shirts sagged at the collarbones, sleeves folded back 3 times to expose thin wrists, trousers cinched with twine. It was clear the garments had not been chosen for comfort or fit, but for uniformity, as if someone had dressed them for display. Their faces carried the contradiction of youth already aged. The eyes were wide and unblinking, but not innocent. They stared into the camera with the watchfulness of witnesses rather than children, as though they knew the click of the shutter was not for them, but for a record. In the photograph, there is no trace of laughter, no hint of play. Their mouths are pressed shut, their expressions controlled, as though instructed. A detail that archivists noted later was the way their postures mirrored each other, shoulders squared, hands clasped stiffly at their sides, an eerie symmetry that looked rehearsed. What unsettled researchers most was not what the photograph showed, but what it concealed. The missing corner, torn away by fire or by hand, was exactly where the date would have been stamped. Without it, the image floated untethered, impossible to place with certainty in the timeline of events. Some argued it had been taken in the weeks after the collapse, others insisted it came later, perhaps during their years under company guardianship. The absence of the date turned speculation into obsession. Who had removed it, and why? On the back of the photo, written faintly in pencil, was a single word: porch. Whether it was meant as a location or a reminder is unknown, but it narrowed the scene to the company housing at the edge of Marrow Ridge, where supervisors lived in sturdier homes and children were sometimes photographed for annual reports. The porch timbers, when compared to other archival images, matched those structures. That detail suggested the children were posed not at their own residence, but at a place chosen deliberately, under someone else's roof. In the years that followed, the photograph circulated quietly among historians of psychiatry and industrial welfare programs, each interpreting it through the lens of their discipline. To some, it was evidence of neglect disguised as care. To others, it was a glimpse of how quickly children could be transformed into subjects of record, stripped of individuality, and presented as a set. The burned edge remained a permanent absence, a reminder that the story was being shaped not only by what had been preserved, but by what had been erased. In its silence, the image carried both proof and warning: 6 children reduced to a tableau, their humanity scorched at the margins. At the far edge of Marrow Ridge, where the slag heaps rose like black dunes and the air smelled faintly of iron, stood a brick building the townspeople called Marrow House. On the maps it was listed as a convalescent home, a charitable institution meant to shelter those in fragile health, but the word never sat right with locals. To them it was neither home nor charity. It was simply the clinic, a place where the windows glowed long after midnight and the sound of carts rolled across tiled floors when the rest of the town lay silent. Children dared each other to ride bicycles past its gates, whispering stories of what went on inside. They said the night nurses carried syringes the way other women carried purses, swinging from their fingers like keys, and that their clipboards were heavy with secrets no one outside was meant to see. From the street, the building looked solid, even respectable. 2 stories of red brick, a peaked roof, windows framed with white trim. The front garden was always clipped, hedges trimmed straight, flowers planted in symmetrical rows. But the orderliness made people uneasy rather than reassured. There was something staged about its neatness, as if the appearance of care had been cultivated to obscure what lay beyond the threshold. Neighbors noted the way curtains were always drawn, even on bright days, and how delivery trucks arrived at odd hours, never groceries or linens, but crates too heavy for one man to carry. For the Marrow children, Marrow House was both residence and prison. After the collapse and the ledger's cold entry of Guardian Company Trust, they were brought here under the explanation of medical observation. They were said to need special attention, rest for their lungs, treatment for injuries invisible to the eye, yet few in town ever saw them outside. Occasionally, a group of 6 would be led into the yard, dressed in identical coats, made to walk in circles like patients on a prescribed exercise regimen. Their faces were pale, their movements subdued, and the nurses who accompanied them spoke in clipped tones, as though silence itself were part of the therapy. Inside, according to fragments of later testimony, the building was a place of routines measured not by seasons but by charts. Thermometers lined walls, watches dictated mealtimes, and every night ended with vials and needles. Beds were placed not in cozy rooms, but in rows, a ward disguised as a home. The children learned to read the rhythm of footsteps in the halls, to distinguish the soft-soled shoes of a nurse from the hard leather of a supervisor. They said the building hummed at night, a sound that seemed to seep from the walls, low and steady, like a machine that never stopped running. In town, parents warned their own children to behave lest they be sent to Marrow House. It became shorthand for discipline and mystery alike. And though the official plaque spoke of healing, everyone knew the truth that lived in whispers. Marrow House was not built for recovery, it was built for watching, measuring, and keeping. The records from Marrow House, when they finally surfaced in the dusty archive of a state hospital, bore the unmistakable marks of bureaucracy trying to make children disappear. Each of the 6 siblings had been reduced to a single letter and number, Eon through E6. The shorthand looked clinical, efficient, as if it were enough to contain an entire life in 3 characters of ink. What struck researchers later was the color of the pencil used. Not black, not red, but a faint blue that faded with time, as though it had been chosen deliberately to look temporary. Beneath the codes, the medical notes were methodical height, weight, respiration, observations about compliance or agitation, but the humanity of the children was nowhere to be found. It was only when a set of later files appeared that the names changed: Evan, Elsie, Edith, Eli, Emmett, Eve. Soft, almost tender choices, names that seemed designed to comfort outsiders rather than the children themselves. The handwriting was different, cleaner, with an air of deliberate substitution. The pseudonyms were never meant for the children to own, only for the public to consume. In the margins of one report, a note in the same blue pencil explained the decision. Public inquiries increasing. Maintain anonymity. The phrase carried both caution and calculation. By then, the story of the miracle siblings had drifted beyond Marrow Ridge. Newspaper clippings had reached other towns, even neighboring states, and letters had begun to arrive asking after the children's welfare. Were they thriving? Could they be visited? Could donations be sent? To answer such questions truthfully would have exposed too much. So the solution was to create a protective fiction. The pseudonym softened the reality, placing a veil over the ledger entries that had once named them with finality. In public pamphlets distributed by the coal company, and later by state health officials, these new names appeared in carefully curated anecdotes. Evan loved to draw. Elsie was fond of singing hymns. Edith enjoyed embroidery. Eli and Emmett were inseparable in play. Eve smiled often. These vignettes read like fairy tales, polished and rehearsed, designed to reassure donors and reporters that the children were safe, ordinary, and loved. But behind the facade, the children knew their real names were gone. Staff addressed them by the pseudonyms, as if the past could be erased through repetition. When the youngest, Eve, once asked a nurse why her name was different now, she was told simply, "This is better for you." The answer was not protection, but containment. To the outside world, they were figures in a story. To the institution, they were subjects in a study. And to themselves, they were beginning to feel like echoes, shadows of children who had once been real but had been filed away under blue pencil and careful invention. Every Monday morning at Marrow House began with the ritual of measurement. The children lined up barefoot on the cold floorboards, gowns hanging loose on their small frames as the nurses wheeled in the scales. Each sibling stepped forward in turn, standing rigid while numbers were recorded with mechanical precision. Their weights were jotted down on charts that carried no names, only the coded identifiers that had replaced them. Next came the bone surveys, a procedure that sounded benign but carried a peculiar cruelty. The children were positioned under fluoroscopes, their skeletons glowing in eerie outlines as doctors peered at the shadows cast onto glass plates. Notes were taken on bone density, marrow thickness, and signs of brittleness. The procedure left them dazed, their eyes blinking against the after-images. After the weigh-ins and surveys came the clippings. Locks of hair were snipped close to the scalp, tied into labeled envelopes, and sent off to laboratories beyond the town. To the children, it felt like being shorn of identity again and again. To the staff, it was data, a way to test what the body absorbed from the air, the food, the water. They called it exposure assays, a term that stripped away any trace of humanity. The assays became a weekly benchmark, rising and falling with invisible tides that few understood. The results were predictable, at least to those who bothered to compare them to the rhythms of the mine. When the shafts beneath Marrow Ridge were active, when carts rumbled through the night and chimneys coughed out smoke, the charts recorded spikes. Numbers climbed, counts thickened, the children's bodies telling the story of what the mine exhaled. When the mine closed temporarily, either from strikes or accidents, the averages fell back down. The children's bodies were barometers, their marrow keeping the calendar of industrial life. In town, families measured survival by wages and bread. At Marrow House, survival was tallied by grams, millimeters, microcuries. The children began to internalize the language of the staff, speaking of good weeks and bad weeks in terms of numbers, rather than feelings. A half-pound gain was praised, a fractional drop scolded. They learned to expect the sharp smell of disinfectant, the cold grip of calipers against their arms, the endless charting of their growth and decline. To outsiders, it might have seemed like care medical attention in an era when many children went without, but the precision revealed another motive. These were not simple checkups. They were experiments stretched across months and years, reducing 6 young lives to a series of fluctuations. In the archives, the surviving charts appear neat, orderly, and detached. Rising lines, falling curves, peaks and valleys that seem almost abstract. Only when placed against the mine's production logs does the pattern reveal itself. The Marrow children were being mapped as living instruments, their very bodies turned into registers of industry, spiking and settling like dust carried on the wind. The night began like a practice everyone in Marrow Ridge had grown accustomed to. The siren at the pit wailed its high metallic cry, rising and falling in the air like the voice of a machine warning its own masters. Usually, drills ended quickly. Families would step outside, glance toward the slag heaps, and wait until the sound wound down before returning to their porches. But this time, the siren did not stop. It carried on, stretching into minutes, until even the seasoned miners' wives grew uneasy. Some swore the pitch changed, trembling into a frantic urgency that drills never carried. Then, the cloud appeared. A blue-gray mass crept across the hollow, hugging the ground as though it were heavier than air. It drifted past fences and seeped between houses, a haze that caught in the throat. Neighbors described the taste as metallic, bitter, and dry, a smell of stone split too violently. Lamps glowed dimmer inside the haze, and chickens in coops went suddenly quiet. The town knew this was no drill. Something had broken open beneath the earth, and the warning sirens were no longer practice. They were confession. At Marrow House, the response was swift and rehearsed, but stripped of any reassurance. The 6 children were shaken awake, their feet pushed into slippers, and hustled down the narrow stairwell to the basement. The nurses did not speak, except in clipped commands. The children later remembered the smell of starch and iodine clinging to the uniforms, and the way the nurses' hands trembled even as they guided them with practiced force. In the basement, the air was cooler but close. A humming generator lit the room with a dull yellow glow, casting long shadows against the cement walls. Beds had been arranged in rows as if waiting for this moment. What exactly happened in those hours remains uncertain. The official account in the county report called it a precautionary relocation due to a minor gas release, but the nurse's log for that night tells a more fragmented story. The surviving pages list pulse checks, blood draws, and repeated notations of coughing fits, followed abruptly by a gap. 3 entire pages have been torn out, the ragged edges still visible in the binding. When the notes resume, the tone is different, calmer, routine, as though nothing unusual had occurred. The missing pages left only speculation. For the townspeople outside, the memory of that cloud lingered longer than the fumes themselves. Some swore their gardens wilted the following week, others recalled livestock falling ill. But what no one forgot was the silence of the children afterward. For days they were not seen in the yard, not marched in circles or taken for their measured walks. When they did reappear, their faces were paler, their eyes ringed dark, their movements slowed. To neighbors, it looked like fear. To researchers decades later, it looked like exposure. Either way, the night of the sirens entered the lore of Marrow Ridge as a moment when the ground itself seemed to rise up, and the children of Marrow House became captives of a secret sealed in missing pages. The nights inside Marrow House were the longest hours of the day. Once the overhead lamps dimmed and the ward slipped into silence, the 6 children were left alone with the hum of the building and the muffled footsteps of nurses making their rounds. Talking was forbidden after lights out, punishable by extra drills in the morning, or, worse, by injections labeled as sedatives, but experienced by the children as thick hours of stupor. Yet silence, for them, was unbearable. It was in those restless hours that the 2 brothers, Eli and Emmett, found a way to bend the rules without breaking them. They began with small experiments, tapping lightly against the metal frames of their beds. At first, it was no more than a game, little coded rhythms meant to irritate one another or to mimic the dripping of a pipe. But soon they discovered that if they assigned meaning to each sequence, they could carry on conversations that no nurse could overhear. A single tap meant yes, 2 meant no. A cluster of 3 short taps followed by 1 long meant, "Are you awake?" Within weeks, the code grew more elaborate, each pattern carrying sentences compressed into rhythms. The other siblings watched with curiosity until they, too, began to learn the language. Before long, all 6 could communicate through the frames, a secret dialogue carried along the iron like whispers in steel. For the children, it was simply called knocking back. If one sent a message, the other had to reply, even with the faintest tap, to prove they were still there, still listening. In the darkness, that reassurance mattered more than words. Knocking back meant survival, solidarity, proof that they had not yet been separated into silence. The code carried jokes, confessions, small comforts. Hungry. Scared. Remember the creak? Sometimes it was nothing more than the rhythm of a lullaby, tapped softly until sleep came. Years later, researchers who studied their case files labeled the practice adaptive resilience. They described it as a coping mechanism, a creative use of limited resources to sustain emotional bonds under conditions of stress. But the language of psychology stripped away the intimacy. For the Marrow children, it was not theory, but necessity. It was how they reminded themselves that they were more than subjects, more than initials on charts. Even decades afterward, survivors who spoke about those years recalled the code with a kind of reverence. The sound of metal tapped in the night had carried them through fear that could not be spoken aloud. In a place where their names were erased, and their lives recorded in blue pencil, the knock of a brother or sister on the bedframe was the truest reminder that they still belonged to one another. The division began quietly, as most things at Marrow House did. One morning, the 6 children were split into 2 groups without explanation, led to different ends of the dining hall where tables had been set in neat symmetry. To outsiders, it might have looked like a matter of order, perhaps an attempt at discipline or efficiency. But the children soon noticed the difference. At one table, meals arrived in sealed tins opened with a small clicking device, portions weighed and measured before being served. Water was poured from kettles still steaming, boiled until it carried the faint taste of metal. At the other table, food came from the same camp kitchen that fed the miners' families, stews ladled from heavy pots, bread carried in baskets, water drawn straight from the pump. The staff called it diet, environment differentials, a phrase scrawled across the top of lab notes with the same detached tone that filled their ledgers. One set of children was the control, the other the field. In practice, it meant half of them ate like specimens and the others like locals. The differences were tracked meticulously. Charts recorded who coughed, who gained weight, who lost appetite, who grew listless. Hair samples and blood tests were matched against meals, creating a pattern of cause and effect that only the researchers could interpret. For the children, the distinction was simpler. One table required clean hands. Before eating, the nurses would scrub their fingers with carbolic soap until their skin stung and their knuckles reddened. The others were allowed only a quick rinse, if that. They began to call it the clean hands table. The phrase carried both pride and bitterness. To sit there was to be treated as delicate, handled like porcelain, your food wrapped in tins and your utensils shined until they reflected your face. But it also meant distance, the knowledge that you were being watched for signs of fragility, that your body was no longer entirely your own. Those at the other table whispered about stews richer in flavor, bread still warm from ovens, food that felt real. The clean hands children envied that warmth even as they were told their rations were safer. Decades later, in interviews and archival accounts, the distinction between the 2 tables became a symbol of the way Marrow House divided the siblings from one another. What had once been a family became a controlled comparison. Researchers praised the design of the experiment, noting how clearly the results showed environmental factors interacting with baseline health. But the language of science masked the quiet cruelty. For the children, the experiment was not theory but hunger, envy, and the sting of soap on raw skin. The line between the clean hands table and the other never truly disappeared. It lingered as a memory of how survival itself had been split, not by chance, but by design. They were told it was only a picture, something like the photographs taken on the porch, except this time their bones would be the subject instead of their faces. The machine was wheeled into the ward, tall and boxy, humming with a low current. The nurses called it the fluoroscope. To the children, it looked like an engine stripped of its wheels. One by one, they were guided onto a stool beneath its glow. A panel lit up, throwing a pale green wash across their skin. They sat still while the doctors leaned in close, peering as though the light opened a secret window inside their bodies. The first time Eli saw his ribs projected on the screen, he thought they looked like the strings of a harp, fragile and humming with a sound only the doctors could hear. Emmett laughed nervously, pointing at the faint flicker of his teeth, glowing like tiny lanterns in his jaw. But the laughter didn't last. The longer they sat under the machine, the hotter the light felt, sinking into their chests and bellies. Their eyes watered, their skin prickled, and though none dared speak, the word hurts passed between them silently. The doctors never asked if it hurt. Their notes were clinical, clipped, and free of doubt. Each negative image was captured on glass plates, dark silhouettes with pale bones glowing sharp against the black. Captions were scribbled beneath in neat script: demonstrates uptake, uniform density, no anomaly. The language sounded almost admiring, as though the children's skeletons had performed a trick worth recording. No mention was made of how long they were kept still, or how their legs trembled when they climbed down from the stool, or how their throats felt scorched for hours afterward. The screenings became routine. Once a month, sometimes more, the machine returned, and the ritual repeated. The children began to dread the day when the curtains were drawn around the ward and the smell of ozone drifted through the air. They learned to recognize the doctor's brisk tone, the way he tapped his pen against his clipboard as though eager to collect more images. For him, each glowing bone was confirmation that the body was absorbing exactly what it should. For them, it was another reminder that their bodies were no longer their own. In later years, researchers praised the data. The images of the Marrow children's bones became teaching tools, cited in lectures as clear demonstrations of exposure and metabolism. Students were shown ribs like harp strings, teeth like lanterns, vertebrae outlined in eerie precision. They were told the case proved how the environment left its mark on the body, how science could see beneath the skin. No one mentioned the children themselves, or the quiet way they endured the glow, or the word they whispered to each other when the doctors left the room. Hurts. The box was found decades later in the storage room of a small parish on the edge of Marrow Ridge, wedged between hymnals and rusted candlesticks. It was an ordinary cardboard crate, its sides soft with damp, its lid collapsing inward. Inside were bundles of letters tied neatly with twine, each addressed in a careful hand to the same recipient, an aunt in Ohio. None bore stamps. None had ever left the town. The envelopes were yellowed, edges curled, ink faded to the color of ash, yet the words inside were still legible, and what they revealed was both ordinary and unsettling. Every letter carried the same phrases, repeated like a catechism. "We are fine. We are learning. Please don't come." The handwriting varied, some blocky, some small and delicate, but the sentences never strayed. It was as if the children had been instructed to write a single script again and again, each letter a reassurance that all was well, each a plea to keep distance. The uniformity of the words made them sound less like communication and more like a performance, a chorus of identical voices insisting on calm. What unsettled archivists who read them was the absence of detail, no mention of meals or games, no names of teachers or neighbors, no anecdotes about weather or seasons. The letters floated in a vacuum, lifeless except for the command they carried. "We are fine. We are learning. Please don't come." They gave nothing, asked for nothing, sealed themselves against intrusion. Yet among the stack was one that broke the pattern. The page was smudged, the ink blurred as if a hand had shaken while writing. In the margin, faint but unmistakable, were the words, "It hums at night." The phrase appeared once, never repeated, and bore no correction. Whoever wrote it had slipped it into the letter as though trying to slip past a guard. What hummed was not explained. Some later speculated it referred to the generator in the basement of Marrow House, the low thrum that filled the nights when the children tried to sleep. Others believed it might have been the machine used for their examinations, its electrical current leaking into the walls. The presence of that single line transformed the box from artifact to testimony. It was the only glimpse of unfiltered voice, the only trace of something unscripted. The pastor who preserved the letters never spoke of them, perhaps sensing their weight, perhaps fearing what they implied. But when they surfaced, they revealed a strange paradox. 6 children had been made to write that they were safe, that they were learning, that they did not want visitors. And yet in one smudged admission, the silence cracked open and the truth slipped out. At night, it hummed. And they heard it. And they wanted someone to know. The records of Marrow House name him only in passing, a young resident assigned for a rotation in 1936, his signature neat and unassuming at the bottom of medical charts. Dr. Alton Gray was not meant to be more than a footnote, another doctor in the long line of trainees sent through the institution to hone their craft. But among the piles of clinical notes and carbon copies, his presence lingers more vividly because of what he chose to write outside official channels. Gray kept 2 journals during his months at Marrow House. One was clinical, meticulous in its details, the sort of document supervisors expected to see. The other was private, small enough to slip into a coat pocket, its pages filled with observations that revealed more than numbers could. In the clinical journal, the children became specimens. Their weights and blood counts were logged with the cold rhythm of science. E2 pulse steady, no aberrations. E5 growth stunted, diet monitored. E6 slight tremor, repeat assay. Each entry was written without flourish, the language of a man who knew what his superiors demanded. But the private journal told a different story. In it, Gray described the children not as initials but as people. He wrote of Elsie's habit of folding paper scraps into tiny boats, of Emmett's stubborn refusal to flinch under the fluoroscope, of Eve's tendency to hum when she thought no one listened. He noted the dread in their eyes when the syringes appeared, and the silence they carried after lights out. One entry has been quoted many times by those who later studied the Marrow case. Data is immaculate. Ethics are not. The line sits stark on the page, underlined once, as though Gray wanted to remind himself of its weight. For all his clinical skill, he could not ignore the gulf between the precision of the data and the cruelty of its collection. In other notes, he admitted his unease at the way the children were spoken of by the senior staff. Assets, controls, field subjects. He questioned why the missing pages of the nurse's log were never addressed. Why the children were kept indoors long after the sirens had faded. 3 months after he arrived, Gray was transferred. Officially, it was routine, a reassignment to another hospital in the state system. Unofficially, some suspected he had asked too many questions, or that his private writings had been discovered. After his departure, the warmth of his notes disappeared from the record. The children returned to being initials, their humanity flattened again into numbers. Yet the fragment of his private journal that survived left behind a haunting contradiction. Here was a doctor who saw them, who recorded their small acts of resistance and fragility, and who dared to admit that the data was flawless only because the children bore the cost. His absence was felt not in silence but in the sharpness of the void that followed. The photograph appears cheerful at first glance, almost idyllic. A bright summer afternoon in Marrow Ridge, sunlight cutting sharp angles across the grass, men in dark suits and straw hats standing with their families in neat clusters. At the center of the frame are the Marrow children, dressed in freshly pressed white outfits that bear no resemblance to their everyday clothes. The boys wear shirts stiff with starch, collars buttoned tight against their throats. The girls are arranged in dresses trimmed with lace, their hems grazing the tops of shoes shined to a mirror polish. Each child holds a kite, bright fabric squares attached to thin wooden frames, strings wound neatly around spools that dangle from their hands. The executives appear behind them, posed with broad smiles that seem rehearsed, as if the camera were meant to capture both charity and success. These men had been responsible for the mine, for the wages and the dust, for the collapse that had killed fathers and scattered families. Yet in the photo they stand as benefactors, hands resting lightly on their canes or tucked into pockets, their presence meant to suggest oversight and care. The children, positioned at the front, serve as proof. Proof that the company had not abandoned its dependents. Proof that survival itself could be turned into a publicity image. But the background refuses to cooperate with the intended message. Behind the cheerful rows, past the white dresses and flying kites, the photograph catches the edge of the slurry pond. Its surface gleams dark, reflecting the sky in oily ripples, rimmed with wooden stakes carrying warning signs that tilt in the breeze. The lettering is large enough to read even through the grain of the print. No trespassing. Danger. Contaminated. Yet no one in the picture looks toward it. The signs stand like mute witnesses, ignored, as though their presence were part of the landscape rather than a hazard. Decades later, archivists would note the irony. A photograph meant to project hope and order had accidentally preserved evidence of what the town already knew, that danger was never far from celebration. The slurry pond, fed by waste from the mine, was as much a part of Marrow Ridge as the company itself. Children from the town whispered about fish that surfaced belly up, about birds that fell silent after landing near its banks. And yet here were the Marrow children posed before it, their kites held like emblems of innocence. The photo circulated in company pamphlets, in regional papers, even in a trade magazine praising Marrow Consolidated's commitment to community welfare. Readers saw white clothes, smiling faces, and executives at ease. What they did not see or chose not to see was the shadow cast by the slurry pond, a reminder that beneath the polished image lay a truth the photograph could never fully hide. The change came quietly, so quietly that at first it seemed like nothing more than a passing mood. Elsie, one of the quieter Marrow children even in her younger years, simply stopped speaking. At 13, she closed her mouth against the world and never opened it again in words. Nurses prodded, teachers coaxed, her siblings tapped messages on the bed frames in the code they had all mastered, but Elsie gave no reply. Her silence became her defense, her rebellion, and her sentence. In place of speech came drawings. She filled the margins of worksheets, the backs of medical charts accidentally left on tables, scraps of brown wrapping paper lifted from supply rooms. What began as idle sketches soon revealed a disturbing precision. She drew the building, not in portraits or flourishes, but in grids. Straight lines connected by angles, forming blueprints of halls, stairwells, and rooms. She marked doors with arrows, vents with dots, pipes with blackened lines that stretched through walls and floors. Every drawing mapped a hidden geography of Marrow House, as if her silence had been converted into a kind of X-ray vision. The staff dismissed them at first, treating the sketches as nonsense or symptoms. Yet the longer she drew, the harder they were to ignore. Elsie charted crawl spaces that even orderlies forgot existed, ducts that carried air from one ward to another, panels in the basement that led into walls no one admitted were hollow. Most unsettling of all were the arrows that converged on a single point she labeled again and again: the warm room. The words appeared in her tight, blocky handwriting, sometimes underlined, sometimes scrawled with enough pressure to tear the paper. Her siblings whispered about it, piecing together what she meant. They remembered nights when the floors beneath their beds vibrated faintly, when a low hum filled the silence, when the air itself seemed to radiate heat. Elsie's maps suggested it came from somewhere hidden, somewhere the children were never taken. She drew the warm room as if she had seen it herself, though none could say how. Some believed she had glimpsed it during one of the examinations, carried further than the others, her silence forged in what she found there. The nurses confiscated her drawings whenever they surfaced, but Elsie never stopped. Each time one was taken, another appeared. The silence became her testimony, and the maps her voice. Years later, when researchers combed through surviving scraps tucked into files and journals, they marveled at the accuracy of her renderings. They called it pathological obsession, evidence of disordered thought. But her siblings knew better. Elsie had not lost language, she had redirected it. Where words were censored, she drew the truth. And in the lines of her maps, the secret of the warm room lingered, daring anyone who looked closely to follow. In the basement of Marrow House, there was a door that was never locked yet, never openly acknowledged. It had no plaque, no label, not even the painted numbers that marked storage closets and utility rooms. To the staff, it was simply there, a threshold passed in silence, but to the children, it carried the weight of secrecy. They named it the warm room, after the first time they dared to press their palms to the handle and felt heat radiating through the metal. The air outside the door was always a degree thicker, a faint hum vibrating through the concrete floor as though the building itself were breathing. Those who entered on official business carried clipboards and spoke in clipped tones. A thermometer was mounted beside the frame, its red column often pushed as high as the glass could hold. Nurses sometimes glanced at it, frowning, then looked quickly away. A strip of masking tape affixed to the door carried the warning, "Do not enter without dosimeter." The word was foreign to the children, but its shape stuck in their memory. They whispered it at night like a charm, certain it meant danger. On rare occasions, the door was left ajar. Through the narrow crack, the children glimpsed glimpses of what lay inside. Tall metal tanks connected by pipes, a cabinet that glowed faintly and hummed without pause, glass dials blinking in steady rhythm. The walls were lined with shelves of jars filled with clear liquid, each tagged with numbers instead of names. The smell was sharp and metallic, prickling the nose. The children imagined it as a hive, the tanks like giant honeycombs, the cabinet like a queen that never slept. Once the name was spoken aloud, it stuck. To them, it was no longer the warm room, it was the hive. Elsie's maps had already drawn attention to it, but the reality surpassed even her sketches. During drills or late-night transfers, the siblings were marched past the door, and in those moments they felt the hum resonate in their chests. It unsettled them in ways they could not explain, as though the hive were not only a machine but a presence, aware of who walked above it. Decades later, when fragments of testimony surfaced, researchers speculated about the purpose of the room. Some said it was a laboratory for chemical assays. Others suspected radiation experiments tied to early industrial research. The surviving documents gave nothing concrete, only logs of maintenance and references to calibration cycles. Yet the memory of the hive remained etched into the children's accounts. They remembered the warmth that seeped into the basement air, the warning sign no one explained, and the way silence always thickened as they passed. To the world outside, Marrow House was a convalescent home. But for the children, it was also a building that contained a secret core, a hive that hummed through the night, feeding on their fear. He arrived in a gray sedan on a Thursday morning, stepping out with the brisk confidence of someone who had already decided what he would find. The man was from the state, an inspector whose visits were scheduled just often enough to satisfy bureaucratic requirements but never long enough to disturb routine. He carried a clipboard under one arm and a stopwatch in his pocket, a tool he produced with the ceremony of an official measuring more than time. The staff greeted him with careful smiles, guiding him through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and starch, their footsteps echoing too loudly on the polished floors. The children watched from their places as the man made his rounds. He counted beds, touching the frames lightly as though their number alone proved care. He walked down the dining hall, timing how long it took for plates to be placed before each child. He inspected fire exits, pushing on the bars to confirm they opened freely, though none of the children had ever been allowed near them unsupervised. At each station, he scribbled notes in a tidy, looping hand, nodding at the efficiency before moving briskly onward. The staff kept pace with him, answering questions rehearsed so often that their words carried no hesitation. What he did not do was linger. He did not pause long enough to see how the children sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes lowered. He did not notice the pale circles under their eyes, or the way they flinched at the sound of the hum rising faintly through the floorboards. His stopwatch ticked away, recording the intervals of meals and inspections, but not the silences that filled the room once he turned his back. He saw the order, the symmetry, the polished surfaces, but not the dread. When his tour ended, he returned to his sedan with the same brisk confidence he had arrived with. His report, filed neatly within the week, praised the facility for its cleanliness, for the punctuality of its staff, for what he called exemplary order. The words stood like a seal of approval, a guarantee that the institution was not only functioning but flourishing. There was no mention of the basement, no mention of the unmarked door with its thermometer pegged high, or the sign that warned of dosimeters. The inspector did not record the hum that threaded through the building at night, vibrating faintly against the ribs of those who tried to sleep. His stopwatch measured only what could be seen, and what could be seen was enough for the state. For the children, the visit passed like a shadow, a moment of false hope that someone might notice what lay hidden. Instead, the official smile of the inspector closed over the truth, leaving the hum untouched, unheard, and unrecorded. The winter of 1937 settled hard over Marrow Ridge, the slag heaps crusted with ice, the air raw enough to sting the lungs. Inside Marrow House, the radiators hissed, but the children felt no warmth. Nights stretched long, broken only by the hum from the basement and the restless shuffle of nurses moving from ward to ward. It was during one of those nights that Emmett whispered to Eve that they had to try. He was 15, old enough to feel the press of walls as a kind of suffocation. She was barely 13, still carrying the soft edge of childhood, but brave in the way only the youngest could be. They slipped from their cots after lights out, moving silently across the floor, careful not to rattle the frames that had betrayed them before. The hall smelled of iodine and soap. At the stairwell, they paused, listening. The building seemed to breathe with them, the hum below rising faintly, masking their footsteps as they crept out the side door into the cold. Snow fell in soft veils, muffling the sound of their movements. For the first time in years, the night sky stretched above them without ceiling or curtain, and it felt like freedom. They made it as far as the fence that ringed the property. Its wire glistened with frost, the top crowned with twisted coils. Emmett tested the lowest rung, tugging it upward just enough to slip through, but before he could motion Eve forward, a light swept across the yard. The beam caught them frozen against the wire, pale figures in the snow. A guard approached, his boots crunching deliberately, the glow of his lantern casting their shadows long against the drifts. He did not shout, did not run, only escorted them back with a hand on each shoulder, firm but not violent, as though herding livestock. The official incident report filed the next morning reduced the event to a single line. 2 subjects observed near perimeter. Cause, curiosity. Returned without incident. The word stripped the night of its desperation, recasting it as a child's wandering. No mention was made of the snow pressed into Eve's coat or the raw scrape on Emmett's hand from the wire. The attempt was written out of history before it had even happened. But Eve, who had taken to keeping a small diary in the margins of hymnals left in the chapel, recorded it differently. In shaky, smudged handwriting, she wrote only 3 words: "We tried." It was both confession and declaration, proof that the desire for escape had lived inside them, however briefly. Long after the report gathered dust, her words carried the weight of truth. They had tried, and that mattered, even if the road was never reached. The camera crew arrived in Marrow Ridge without warning, their truck rattling down the main street with the kind of equipment the townspeople had only seen in newsreels. Tripods, reels of film, lights packed into crates, all carried with a purposeful haste that suggested a script had already been written. They came not to document the town, but to capture Marrow House. For days before their arrival, the staff had been preparing. Mattresses were replaced with crisp new ones, their tags still dangling. The hallways were scrubbed until they gleamed with the sharp scent of bleach. Even the windows, usually filmed with dust, were polished to a clarity that felt unnatural. When the cameras rolled, the children were arranged like stage props. A piano was wheeled into the main hall, though none of them had ever been given lessons before. Elsie was placed on the bench, her small hands guided to the keys, while a nurse whispered instructions. The melody that came out was halting, little more than scales, but the cameraman smiled, satisfied. The scene would read as culture, as proof of enrichment. Behind Elsie, the others were instructed to sit with straight backs, their faces tilted toward the light. On cue, a voice clapped sharply, and the children followed, their applause ringing hollow against the tile. The narration was recorded later, a polished baritone that promised the public something the walls of Marrow House did not hold. Here in Marrow Ridge, it declared, our nation provides modern care for our neediest. Clean facilities, dedicated staff, and opportunities for growth ensure that every child thrives. The film's images matched the words: beds lined in perfect order, nurses walking with clipboards, children smiling on command, the humming from the basement, the smell of iodine and metal, the silence of nights filled with tapping on bed frames. None of it made it to the reel. When the short film was screened months later in civic halls and church basements, it was greeted with nods of approval. Audiences saw order where there was fear, progress where there was secrecy. They clapped politely, some even donating to state programs that promised to replicate Marrow House's success. What they could not know was how carefully the film had been staged, how every smile had been rehearsed, how every clap was forced. For the children, the day of filming remained etched in memory, not for the piano or the lights, but for the absurdity of it all. They had been transformed into evidence, their lives rearranged for a performance meant to soothe strangers. The reel lasted less than 10 minutes, but it erased years of truth. In the film, they looked cared for. In reality, they were only actors in a script they had never agreed to read. The day the mind died began with a sound that carried for miles. A deep, concussive blast rolled up through the seams of Marrow Ridge, shaking windows and rattling crockery from shelves. The men in town knew immediately it was not a drill, nor a routine blast meant to open new chambers. This was collapse. The lowest seam, the one thought to be the richest, had given way. Dust and smoke rose from the mouth of the shaft like a dark geyser, blotting the sky until noon looked like dusk. Families crowded the street outside the pit office, faces gray with fear and soot, waiting for names that would never be read. The explosion sealed not only the seam, but the company's future. Marrow Consolidated had been running thin even before that day, its debts mounting, its promises to workers stretched beyond breaking. With the lowest seam buried, investors withdrew, creditors circled, and within weeks the company folded. Pay stopped, stores closed. The town that had been built on coal and loyalty found itself hollowed out overnight. Marrow House, sustained entirely by the company trust, felt the collapse with ruthless immediacy. Supplies dwindled, salaries lapsed, and the once frequent visits of executives disappeared altogether. The staff were given orders to wind down operations. In one surviving nurse's journal, the phrase is written starkly: discharges accelerated. Children who had been kept under watch for years were suddenly bundled into coats and handed over to county officials with little more than a paper folder and a note of transfer. No ceremony, no explanation, only dispersal. The Marrow children were not sent together. Quietly, deliberately, they were scattered into homes across the county. Some were placed with farming families who needed labor, others with households already strained by poverty. Each was introduced not as a child of miracle or study, but as another ward of the state, an orphan with no history that anyone cared to repeat. The names they had been given at Marrow House, Evan, Elsie, Edith, Eli, Emmett, Eve, were written into the files as if they had always been theirs, while their real names, whatever they had been, dissolved into silence. Neighbors recalled seeing the transfers in fragments. A boy climbing into a wagon, his face turned stubbornly toward the ground. A girl clutching a bundle of papers tied with twine. Another staring back at the house as if willing it to remember her. Within days, the building was emptied, its windows shuttered, the hum from the basement gone at last. To the town, the mine's death was catastrophe. To the children, it was erasure. The place that had defined them, however, cruelly, was dissolved as if it had never existed. Their scattering marked the end of Marrow House, but also the beginning of a different kind of silence, one where each child carried fragments of memory alone, without witness, into lives that no longer resembled their own. The trail of the Marrow children might have ended with the shuttered doors of Marrow House, if not for a hobbyist with too much patience and an instinct for hidden threads. Decades after the mine collapsed and the institution dissolved, she sifted through county baptismal registers, orphan intake ledgers, and hospital files. The names never matched cleanly, but then she noticed the pseudonyms, the soft decoy names given by the clinic: Evan, Elsie, Edith, Eli, Emmett, Eve. When cross-indexed with the original baptismal records from a small parish near the Ridge, 6 children appeared faintly, their real names scratched into ledgers but obscured in every official report thereafter. It was as though 2 sets of lives had been superimposed, the children who were born and the children who were measured. What she discovered was grim. 3 of the siblings had died young, their obituaries reduced to a line in county newspapers. No mention of Marrow House, no mention of their shared childhood. The phrasing was always the same: after a long illness. 2 others vanished into silence, their files closing abruptly with the word relocated, their fates untraceable. Whether they left the state or were absorbed into other institutions, the records offered no clue. It was as if they had been erased with the same blue pencil that had once given them their pseudonyms. But one surfaced. A woman living under a new surname, married and retired, her children grown. She agreed to speak only cautiously, never on record, always careful with the details. When asked what it had been like, she paused for a long time before answering. Her voice was steady, even gentle, but the words carried the weight of years. "We were not miracles," she said finally. "We were measurements." The sentence hung in the air, sharp as any confession. She described fragments rather than full stories, rooms too clean to be real, nurses who smelled of carbolic soap, the sound of tapping against bed frames in the dark. She remembered the kites at the company picnic, their strings cutting into her palms, the slurry pond glinting behind them. She recalled the warm room, though she would not elaborate, only saying, "It hummed, and we felt it." What mattered most to her was the silence afterward. How each of them had been scattered with new names, their shared history broken into pieces no one could fit together again. For the hobbyist, the discovery confirmed a suspicion that had begun with a single odd entry in a ledger. For history, it was the faint re-emergence of voices long buried under reports and staged photographs. And for the woman who survived, speaking at last in careful phrases, it was not redemption, but recognition. She had lived long enough to know that the story would never be whole. Yet her words pierced the illusion crafted so many years before. They had not been a miracle to inspire hope. They had been instruments in someone else's experiment, children who carried the weight of a hum no one else could hear.